And before we really look at some of the complexities of the human body, let's look at something that people oftentimes overlook as an evidence for creation. And that is the issue of life itself. Where in the world did life come from? Is life simply just the product of chance and time, where basically molecules came together like we read about with chemical evolution? Is this how this really happened? Let's look at an actual description of how this all happened and ask ourselves an important question as we're looking at this. Number one, are they really telling us anything about how it works? And number two, do we know this for sure? It says 4.5 billion years ago, the young planet Earth was almost completely engulfed by the shallow primordial seas. Powerful winds gathered random molecules from the atmosphere. Some were deposited in the seas. Tides and currents swept the molecules together. Now listen. And somewhere in this ancient ocean, the miracle of life began. Time out. Miracle of life? How many of you know that miracles don't happen naturally? Who's the author of miracles? God, right? Let's go on. It says the first organized form of primitive life was a tiny protozoan, a one-celled animal. Time out. Let's ask an important question. When you hear a claim, you should ask the question, what's the evidence? What's the evidence for this imaginary organism that just came out of nowhere? You know what it is? Zero. We don't have this organism in the test tube to look at, do we? We can speculate about what we think are the minimum requirements for life, but we don't know that for sure. Let's go on. It then says millions of these protozoan populated the ancient seas. Time out. Now we've got millions of miracles within this very first paragraph. Interesting. It goes on to say these early organisms were completely self-sufficient in their seawater world. They moved about their aquatic environment feeding on bacteria and other organisms. Time out. Where did these guys come from? And this next sentence is the greatest leap of faith. It says from these one-celled organisms evolved all life on Earth. Well, you know, we were told when I was a youngster that they formed life in the test tube. Remember that with Stanley Miller's experiment? That was 1953. Did they really make life there? All they did was make some building blocks, and actually the broth that they made it in was poisonous. So even if life could have happened, it would have killed it. But the interesting is when we look at this whole issue from 1953 to today, has things improved with our understanding about this? I decided one day to look in Webster's dictionary and look at this whole idea of what's called spontaneous generation or abiogenesis, which is what we just read from that one little excerpt. And this is what it says. It says the generation of living from non-living matter. Spontaneous generation, a former theory now rejected. Now rejected? You got to be kidding me. What do you mean it's rejected? This is what we're being taught as fact. Well, let's look at some other things. Let's look at what some scientists say. Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, had this to say about the origin of life. And he said this in 1981, so over 25 years after the Stanley Miller experiment. Listen to the words he uses here. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears, at the moment, to be almost a miracle. Well, there's that miracle word again. So many are the conditions which would have had to been satisfied to get it going. Interesting. In 1988, in an abstract from the Interdisciplinary Science Review, it says this about the origin of life. More than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth, rather than to its solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. 1991, in Scientific American, referring to Stanley Miller, says this. Miller, who after almost 4 decades is still in hard pursuit of life's biggest secret, agrees that the field needs a dramatic finding to constrain the rampant speculation. Well, what about today? Have things gotten much better? Here's a quote out of Grolier Multimedia Encyclopedia, year 2001, says both the origin of life and the origin of the major groups of animals remain unknown. So much for us knowing exactly how it happened. Bottom line, when we look at life itself, it is a fundamental evidence for a life-giving creator. There's a basic law known as the law of biogenesis. Life only comes from pre-existing life. And that is a very strong evidence that we can say God truly does exist, as he says.